Okay, well, we are now live and we've got lots and lots and lots of people joining us. So I'm going to do the introduction quite slowly, Barry, so that they miss me and they don't miss any of you. My name is Dame Alison Peacock. I'm the Chief Executive of the Chartered College of Teaching. And this evening, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Professor Barry Carpenter to come and speak to us. Professor Barry has a very illustrious career, so excuse me if I refer to my notes. So he has a career spanning over 40 years. His appointments include Professor of Mental Health in Education to Oxford Brookes University, education-oriented directorships and honorary professorships at universities in Ireland, Germany and Australia, as well as having been head teacher and principal. He's been a fellow of the University of Oxford and speaks and publishes internationally on special educational needs, with particular specialism of autism and girls and engaging learners with complex needs. But most importantly, I think for this evening, for the Chartered College, is that Barry has just recently become one of our fellows, and we're absolutely delighted to welcome him to membership of the Chartered College and to welcome him as a fellow. So he's going to speak to us this evening about planning for next term and how we might think about what's really important in terms of the curriculum that we offer, but the total experience that we offer to all our children and young people. Barry's work has been in tremendous demand over the last number of weeks and months, and we're very, very fortunate to have him give some time to us this evening. So I'm delighted to be able to hand over to you, Barry, and look forward very much to what you've got to say. And we'll have some questions at the end. So thank you very much, Barry. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Can I begin by thanking Alison, firstly, for those warm words of welcome, but also can I thank Alison and the college for the fellowship that has been bestowed upon me. It really is a great honour and something for which I am deeply grateful and very proud. My titles may be many, but at my heart I'm a teacher. That's what I chose to become, and actually that is what I remain. I have never lost sight of that in whatever incarnation I have found myself, and that will be the title of which I am most proud to my dying day. Ours is a most wonderful profession. We get to meet some marvelous children whose lives we transform, but I often wonder, do they transform ours too? So this afternoon, I want to speak about the recovery curriculum, which is not actually 3 months old until this coming weekend. It was published first on the 25th of April. And yet it has been just a roller coaster of a journey. As Alison said, I find myself speaking up and down the country and yet never leaving my house, much to my wife's amusement. And I want to think particularly in looking ahead to the term that we'll be returning to in September, about the reconnection, the recovery and the resilience of our children and young people. Obviously, this is based on that original recovery curriculum piece, which hopefully you've all had access to. But can I particularly point out the recovery curriculum platform website? You'll find there lots of podcasts. By this weekend, there will be 15 podcasts there, covering things like school leadership in the pandemic, covering things like practical approaches, curriculum policies. There's a wonderful one just gone out on school governance for those of you that are wondering how to re-engage your governing bodies who may have found the current time difficult in terms of their association with your respective schools. So please do have a look at that recovery curriculum website, and it will continue to grow over the summer, where we find resources that we think will enable you to do your jobs more effectively in September. And I want to begin by thinking about the mental health of our children and young people, because it's a real worry. And just as I articulated when we wrote the paper, my son Matthew and I, in April, everything we predicted then has been compounded many times over. One of the things that is an abiding worry for me at the moment is that this pandemic is not allowed to rob our children of hope, because hope is the gift of childhood. And that is so precious. We all had dreams and aspirations. Some came to be, some did not. But wasn't it wonderful to dream? Wasn't it marvelous to hope? And that must be so for our children. And perhaps part of our job is going to be restoring that hope in our children and young people. I did a particular lecture for Mental Health Week around this. And if you want to follow up on that, you'll find the reference at the bottom of that slide. These slides will be available through the college at the end of this webinar. So what is the recovery curriculum? I've had people email me asking if they can buy it. Absolutely, you cannot. It's something you do for yourselves and for your schools. You know your children best. You know the demographic of your area. So it's a construct. Matthew and I kicked around whether it should be a concept, but we chose construct because that's part of that broader word, construction. It's about constructing a curriculum that will wrap around your children. They will embrace them once more as learners when they return to your school. It's been really exciting this last week, following the words of Amanda Spielman on Radio 4 last week, when she talked about rebuilding. She talked about no inspections during the autumn, visits from OFSTED to QA to be supportive, but that she was very clear when she said that rebuilding should be about decisions you make based on the needs of each individual child. Some children have lost a lot of time. Rebuilding and recovery are partners. They are bedfellows. Look at the aims and values your school had before the pandemic and let them drive the curriculum for you in the coming term. It has to be about compassionate leadership, not just in the senior team, but you leading your classrooms too. It has to be about being kind and being tender with the children. At times, we can only make best informed judgments. I know that teaching is a relationship-based profession, and that's very much how I prefer to operate, but we've never had this experience before. At times, I find myself applying what I knew before the pandemic, and you'll see that come through in the rest of this presentation. And ultimately, it has to be a personalized response for your school to its body of children and young people. In the recovery curriculum, there are 5 losses. And these losses were constructed based on what was being said about children and young people. So it's a loss of routine, a loss of structure, a loss of friendship, a loss of opportunity, a loss of freedom. Some of those are very self-explanatory. But that just pause for a moment on that loss of opportunity. One A-level student said to me, they told me I was about to run a marathon as I was preparing for my A-levels. Now they tell me there's not even a race. For our year 11s, our year 13s, maybe even our year 6s, there's been a loss of a rite of passage. Some are deeply troubled by what the outcomes of those respective years will be and how it might affect their life opportunities. We need to be confident and able to reassure those young people that whilst they had to be assessed and moderated in a very difficult time, their qualifications will stand up against those of others. They are worthy of the grades that they receive. So those losses are very real. And if you look at what's being said now, and I did a joint presentation with the NHS last week for the DFE, where they gave a position statement on what had been happening to children. And loss was one of their key words. And it combines with other words they used, like anxiety and grief. And in the paper on recovery curriculum, we articulated that there were 4 consequences to those losses: bereavement, attachment, anxiety. And it's the Archbishop of Canterbury said in one of his presentations, all of those are traumas. So those dynamics are going to be accompanying our children as they come through the doors of your school in September. How will they manifest themselves? And what will your responses be when they do present? Because many of our children will walk in confident and seemingly happy. My guess is that a lot of that will be a mask and a camouflage, and that either will remove itself over time, or as you work with the child, you'll realize the fragility of that mask and what lies underneath. As Nikki Stewart has said in one of her pieces, Attachment is a deep and enduring bond. Children attach to you. They trust you. You are important in their lives. And for the child who is insecurely attached, the hurly-burly and bustle of your classroom will be, after a period of lockdown, and that's not a natural state for children, there'll be a real sense of fear and insecurity. Our children will have been hypervigilant. Have you not been hypervigilant? What's it like when you go to shop in the supermarket, where there's people not following the rules, cutting across you? What's it going to be like when we all have to wear masks to go to the supermarket? We won't be able to see each other smile, and the eyes of reassurance will be all that we have available to us in many ways. So those dynamics are going to be very live in our schools. Let's remind ourselves what secure attachment actually means. That when a child is securely attached, they're better problem solvers, they're more curious as learners, they achieve more academically. What's it like socially? It means they're more cooperative, more self-regulative, more socially empathetic, and more self-aware. So there are huge benefits. So where that child seems to be not attached, maybe they are reminded that on that wretched day in March, through no fault of your own, you had to break that bond with that child. In fact, for some children, they've never returned to your class at all. Some children mourn that loss of you, of their classroom, of their school, and certainly of their friendship group. The Royal College of Psychiatrists has articulated a new phenomena, lockdown anxiety. It can only be a phenomena as yet because it hasn't been researched. But again, this is best judgment stuff that's happening across all of the professions. Look at our colleagues in health and in medicine. They at times have had to go about best judgment, applying what has worked in other contexts and might work on coronavirus. And it will be the same for us. We will not get it right all of the time. We're going to have to go through an experimental phase of teaching to get it right for our children. So I've applied what we currently know about anxiety, and based on Murdoch, McCullough, and also the work of Professor Dame Alison Peacock, we know that anxiety is a key block to learning. You see, what happens in the brain when we get anxious is cortisol is released. Now, we all need a bit of cortisol to wake us up and get us going in the day, but if that cortisol level continues to rise to the surface of the brain, then it will prevent an imprint on the brain. So you could have had a child in your class who sits there meek and mild, seems to be getting on with whatever tasks you've set, doesn't say boo to a goose, but in fact that child is rigid with fear. Maybe they're worried that the social distancing in your classroom is too intense. This isn't the beautiful classroom that they remember. There's this hatch tape all around the place. It's not the warm, friendly environment they knew, and there are more rules and requirements for their behavior in school. And so they will get very anxious, and you can ask them after your lesson, what was it I just taught? And they'll just say to you, I don't know. They're not being rude. They truly cannot remember. So what's the impact of what I've just described happening in the brain, the neuroscience? It's actually, for us as teachers, that the anxious child is not a learning child. So what can we do to reduce anxiety? And we do need those recovery conversations to be a dynamic of our daily practice. We need to borrow ideas, and I'm borrowing ideas here from colleagues in New Zealand. I was on the telephone this morning to the principal psychologist in Christchurch, where they have real experience of managing trauma in children, particularly the earthquake situation and the impact of that on children. And one of the things they did in response to their earthquakes in Christchurch was to have a register, central register in each school, so that every teacher knew what had happened to that child. Had they lost their home during the earthquake? Had it been sucked into the ground? We could perhaps in our schools have a pandemic register so that all teachers are aware that things have happened to this child. Their father lost their job. Their mother was a frontline health worker. In fact, I was called into a nearby school just recently where a child there's mother had been very involved, let's say, in the Nightingale Hospital in London. And the child was actually going at times into a catatonic state because they were so hyper anxious about their mother, who is still working on that front line. Maybe they've experienced somebody in their street dying. We cannot have lost 44,000 people in our country without it being somebody's grandparent, somebody's aunt or uncle, relative or neighbor. So there are 5 levers, and these were designed by my son really as pedagogical levers that we might think about when the children return to school. And the first one's about relationships, absolutely key. We can't expect our students to return joyfully, and many of the relationships that were thriving may need to be reinvested in and restored. We need to plan for this to happen, not assume that it will. We need to reach out and greet our children, to use those relationships we've had and we are rebuilding to cushion the discomfort of returning to this new dynamic that's around them in their school. We cannot tell each other enough, colleagues and children, how very pleased we are to see them. We need to treasure those words, because when we say them, we acknowledge that we are survivors, and 44,000 people so far in our country are not. And what about our community? We need to rebuild our school communities. We need to heal the fragmentation in our community. We need to really value parents. We said to them on that day in March, well, we're closing the school and here you are. Here's something to get on with your children, and we'll be sending you stuff online too. And they've had to step up and become their child's teacher, and it has not been easy. So many parents at the moment are speaking about their own anxiety and are worried too that whilst their children may do the online learning, the joy of learning has gone. Of course it has. Our teaching is often designed to be social interactive. Our teaching process is about social reciprocity often, and that's vanished. But maybe we've got a moment here to treasure what it is and build on it. And think too about the learning style of our children. To learn at home is very different to how they need to learn in schools. And we may need to reteach how they learn in schools. Some children will have been 6 months out of school. That's a huge chunk in the lives of the developing child. And the whole thing about transparent curriculum is about asking our children what it is they need to learn. My son asked his student parliament recently online what they wanted from the teachers when they return, and they all said, year 7 to year 12, we want someone to explain to us what coronavirus is. Why is COVID-19 be so destructive? What is a pandemic? I think that's a very fair question from children. Have you got that lesson ready? So it's about co-constructing, co-creating, co-producing a curriculum. And we've got time in this autumn term to do that. I recently launched the RSHE curriculum for the DFE, and I said then that RSHE needs to be at the heart of the curriculum, alongside the core of literacy and numeracy, English and maths, but it needs to be the beating heart of our curriculum in terms of, in the long term, what we can do to aid recovery for those children who have been significantly traumatized, may be to embed those interventions in an RSHE curriculum. And the fifth lever is around space to be, to rediscover and to find a voice in learning that maybe they've lost. It's only natural that we all work at an incredible pace to make sure this group of learners are not disadvantaged against previous generations of children. Provide opportunity and exploration alongside our expectations, alongside their own expectations for themselves as an efficient, effective and successful learner in your schools. So there'll be phases of implementation as I perceive it when the children return. There are those messages for all, like those lessons around coronavirus, that we must articulate the experience we've been through and that our children have been through. I had a teacher ask, should we share emotion with children? Have we not all been anxious, concerned, worried? Let's say that to our children. We're all human beings together, whatever our age, status or titles may be. So it's that holistic recovery, and for some there'll be focused recovery, where some of the resources I want to share with you might be used for those more personalized, needs-led interventions. But for some of our children, it'll be a deep recovery over a longer period of time. I interviewed the Cabot Federation senior leadership team for one of the podcasts, and they've actually planned for a nurture type group for 2 years across the 23 provisions in their federation. Have you built in capacity for recovery over time for your children? So what might a recovery curriculum look like? And from my conversation with Alison, she was very keen that I included examples from teachers, and this was shared by Claire Owens at Churchwood School. And she's saying, what the aims of their recovery curriculum would be, and about emotional resilience, and to develop self-regulation. My guess is some of your children will return very excited, very joyful, and will have lost the capacity to regulate their emotions, and then they'll sweep down into a low mood. And I've already mentioned that need to learn how to learn again. You'll find the PDF that Claire kindly provided free and downloadable on the Recovery Curriculum website. At this school, and again, Katie Fielding, the deputy head, has recorded a podcast for us. These are the aims of what for next term they're calling their rainbow curriculum, about trust in relationships, about managing emotions, about engaging in learning again. And that brings me on to this point about our children who might be disenfranchised. There will be this mask of fear. They'll camouflage themselves in behaviors that avert and divert from the learning experience you're presenting. They'll be switched off, some of our children. And engagement is the liberation of intrinsic motivation. How are you going to engage your children again? How will you re-engage the disengaged? And may I suggest that you might look at the Engagement for Learning website, and some of you will already be familiar with the engagement profile. This is the revised profile as will become statutory summative assessment for children with the HCPs from September 2021. And if you go to the Engagement for Learning website, we've made sure that all of the materials there are realigned to the Rochford Review requirements that the government will be bringing in next year, and they're free and downloadable on that website. Use these lenses to look at your children, to look at how they're initiating, exploring, anticipating, and so on. And where they're not showing evidence, start to give them activities that would specifically target those pathways back to learning. This is a free downloadable resource from the organisation Books Beyond Words. Straight away, some of you will think, well, it's wordless, Barry. There's no words in there, and we've got very high literacy standards in our schools. This is a different story here. If you imagine putting words into this, so if you look at the top right-hand picture there, we might say Yvonne makes a telephone call to 111. When a child is releasing emotion, it's released from the amygdala, which is in the back of the brain. The emotion then transverses the brain through various neural pathways and synaptic activity. If there are words in place, then the frontal cortex has to kick in to decode graphically or phonetically those words. That will block the emotional release. What do we want? Literacy or emotional release? There's a time and a place for both. There has to be a time and a place for both next term. So this is a good stimulus for conversation with children and young people of all ages. It may be by going through this time and time again, by leaving this around your classroom, not just having it online. Children might eventually start to tell their story of what happened in their homes, in their street, in their families. And there are other free resources. Look at the one in the middle there, When Someone Dies from Coronavirus. Yeah, a really raw and tough title, isn't it? But as I've already said, 44,000 people have died, and that has to be someone's grandparent, aunt, uncle, neighbour, or friend. And good and bad days in lockdown. What were they like for the children? Use these to open up topics, not to teach reading, but to open up topics. And I'm proud to announce today that I've been commissioned by Baroness Hollins, the editor-in-chief, to write 2 children's books, which are now finished. And we've commissioned the artist Charlotte Furman from the Furman family. Her father, Peter, created Bagpuss, the Clangers, etc. And as of yesterday, these went out to trial. I actually went to work with years 1 and 5 in our primary school yesterday to check out some sample pictures with the children, to check that they were getting the key messages. I've also been able to raise £12,000, and I've covered the production costs of these books. So by mid-August, these will be free and downloadable for every child in our country. They're there for you to use, to send home, however you want to use them. But Lucy and Lenny have a story to tell, just as your children have their story to tell. And maybe these stories, wordless as they are, will be catalysts for your children's stories too. Wordless books are really very, very useful. And as this parent said, she came to use them with her child as a way of de-stressing at the end of a day, to bring her daughter back to re-engage her into learning. And there's a particular podcast on the Recovery Curriculum website that you might want to follow through There are some other resources I want to recommend because you're thinking about what to use in September. So if you are dealing with grief or mourning or emotions that are within that paradigm, you might want to look at the charity Nurture UK, their bereavement box. They've slashed the price. There are 60 laminated cards in this box, all therefore very wipeable. We like laminate, don't we? These are really useful to use. And in the transition toolbox, which is an absolute must for all primary schools for the year 6, there are 60 cards again. And these will really help that transition. And I think secondaries are probably going to need this box too, because that transition phase is going to have to be extended into secondary next term, because year 6 have not had the experiences we'd normally want to give them. And if we start with an accelerated curriculum, the pace will be too much. Our children will be frail in their learning pathways when they return. So do have a look at these resources. This again has been discounted by the charity to give maximum access to schools. Tina Ray, who's prodigious in her writing, has produced this wellbeing toolkit for mental health leads. Most schools have now got a mental health lead trained or mental health first aider. We never expected that you guys would have to pitch up so quickly, but we need you. Our children have suffered with their mental health in this pandemic, and we need the skills that you have. Tomorrow, I'm pleased to announce that Tina Ray is launching a toolbox of well-being strategies and activities for children coming through the pandemic. She's designed it to be a rollout of the recovery curriculum, and I would highly recommend that again from Hinton House for colleagues, page after page of ideas of what to do. These mental health resources from Butterfly Print are also excellent. There are emotional well-being journals for each key stage that you can use on a personalized basis. There's space for the child's name. You can use them for small group activity for those personalized interventions. You can use them longer term for children who are really disturbed by what has happened to them in these last 6 months. Lockdown is not a natural state for a child. I spoke to the managing director of this company this morning, and he said he's putting a further 10% discount so the schools can recommend these to parents. He's taken out postage and packing. They can be mailed out. I think it's about £4.10 per journal. You've sent home some wonderful stuff for children to work on during this pandemic. Was any of that about their emotional well-being? Over that summer holiday where they're worried about coming back to school, they're not coming back to you, who was their teacher. They're going to another teacher in the next group up. And have you heard the playground talk about what that teacher does to you if you don't get your work right? Let's keep it calm. Let's give our parents something constructive to talk about with their children, to explore children's feelings. And these journals will do just that. And the whole thing about social distancing, and this again is taken from some New Zealand work, looking at that very thing about social distancing and looking at it through dance. And the dances that penguins often do, where they don't actually touch, but they do mirror movements. There's a whole thing about mirroring, imitating, mirror neurons in the brain. If I had more time, I'd talk about that. But believe you me, imitation is the foundation of all learning. I think someone called Piaget also said that. If I synthesized the research to just bring this together around mental health, it would boil down to two things, colleagues: what makes us happy and what makes us sad. The thing is, when you're sad, you know what to pull on that will make you happy. Do our children know that? We talk about pulling on our inner strength in difficult times. It's a fairly abstract concept for a young child or a child with special educational needs and disabilities. We may need to be more tangible and less abstract in what we mean. So one practical intervention may be make a happiness box. What will the children put in the happiness box? And for those extremely perceptive among you, yes, you've guessed it, a happiness box is a converted shoebox. It's been interesting, those schools that have been using these, perhaps with key worker children during the pandemic period, as what the children have put in their boxes. There's a year 6 boy that a head teacher was telling me about, who's put in a piece of soft cloth amongst other things in his happiness box. When he gets time with that box, he rubs that piece of cloth furiously to self-soothe, to self-regulate emotion. He doesn't let anybody see he's doing that. He plays with, he uses something else from his happiness box, and then he sneaks it back in. Nobody mentions it. It's his happiness box. They are his emotions. You know, will our lessons be too long? Will our children be able to concentrate for 45 minutes to an hour? Do we need to chunk the maths lessons into two 15-minute sections with activities in between, maybe a mindfulness activity, 60 mindful minutes from Nurture UK? Or do we need to add an imitation activity, Simon Says? Or do we need to say, children, you can have 5 minutes with your happiness box? Because you can see the fear, the worry that, oh, I didn't cover this work with mom and dad at home. Or as one student said to me yesterday, my mom was hopeless at the maths. And she's worried about, will her maths be good enough for her to go into year 6 next year? So go online. I've written a rationale, so it gives you clear evidence base for using these. I think I'm in danger, therefore, of being remembered as the man who was creative with a shoebox, but never mind. And for those of you that need a rationale, there are other versions of the shoebox on that website as well. Andy Hargreaves said in 2016 about the epidemic of children's physical and mental health, these words, and I could add now that in this age of a pandemic, at this point in history, from teachers, we need creativity, care, and compassion on a scale that we've never witnessed before. It's Bruce Perry who's just so wonderful in understanding the brain of the child and how it functions. The more healthy relationships a child has, the more likely he, she will be able to recover from trauma and thrive. Relationships are the agents of change, and the most powerful therapy is human love. So there are resilience aspects to our education, because a school is a place, education is a process, and educators are people, and colleagues, teaching is a relationship-based profession. I've learned many things in my career, and in my final days as a teacher, there's just one thing I truly know. It's about those relationships. That when you embrace as a learner that child, when you nurture them tenderly, and something magnificent and wonderful happens, and they never forget you for the rest of their lives. Teaching is a relationship-based profession. Colleagues, what was it that called you to be a teacher? Yes, I'm using that old-fashioned phrase that we're a vocation, and we are. What was it in your humanity that called you to be that teacher? Find that in yourself again. That is what you will need on the day your school opens in September, because when those children come to meet you, their new teacher, new subject teacher, or new class teacher, they won't read your fancy name label. They'll look into your eyes, and they'll search for the empathetic human being that lurks there. And when they find that human being, they will offer you their capacity as a learner, for you to take it and treasure it, because you have treasure in your hands, and that treasure can truly transform lives. I wish you well in your endeavours, colleagues. I know that you'll do just a wonderful job, and that so many of our children will benefit hugely from that treasure in your hands. Thank you for listening this afternoon, and again, my sincere thanks for the honour the college has bestowed upon me. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. That was just wonderful. Yes, with the times when I was listening to you, and I sort of felt moved to tears, but that's not going to help any of us. Let's think. In terms of one of the questions that's come through is about, you talk about compassionate leadership, and mainly in your presentation, you're talking about the compassion of the teacher as they think about their class. But there's something also, isn't there, as teachers returning to school, about the leaders that we work for.
Yes.
What does a compassionate leader look like to you?
A compassionate leader is one that is sincere, who is trustworthy, who is kind to their staff, nurturing of their staff, giving opportunities, giving understanding with high expectations. This is going to be tough, but we need to be there for our children. At the end of the day, we are paid to do a job. And it's one that creates that listening and learning environment in their school, that to be kind to each other is what we do. here. We cannot tell each other enough, Alison, that we're glad to see each other, because when we say that, we affirm that we are survivors. And in so doing, we honour too the memory of those in our country who are not.
Thank you. And there's something also, isn't there, about the way in which we think of our families at this time?
Yes.
So I know in my own sort of submissions to the DFE on behalf of the Chartered College, I've been quite concerned about the notion that schools will be issuing penalty notices for children who don't attend. And I understand completely that, you know, everybody wants the world to go back to normal. Not that I'm sure it quite is ready to do that in September. But having an empathy for those families who are worried about the return to school, who may have lost members of their family, having empathy for those family members who you described in your talk, again, about perhaps the parent who has felt underconfident, his or herself, in terms of some areas of the curriculum they've been trying to support their children with. How best do we help our families, do you think, as they prepare to bring the children back next term and throughout the next months and years, probably? What can we do to help?
I was having this conversation yesterday when I went in to do the book trial with some children in our local primary school. I was talking to senior leaders there then. And one of the ideas they were coming up with their chair of governors was the chair of governors was going to be able to offer some, continuing the online bit, which we've all learnt from, that rather than convene a parent meeting and maybe that parent can't get away from work and all of that, and the hours aren't right for them, but have some Zoom type forums where parents can come together and express their delight, perhaps, at how the child has returned to school, but also express their worries. I think some of our parents, without being too crude about it, will be on our backs for a while, because they have had 6 months of responsibility for their child as a learner, and they're not just going to want to give it up. They're going to want to know they did the right thing by their child. That matters hugely to them. That child, all of those children, are very, very precious to those parents. So they will want that dialogue, which is why I said in the lecture, Alison, that this is maybe a time to revisit partnership with parents and get it as a true embedded dynamic in our schools. We think that we've got it, but have we? Let's just ask ourselves. That's not a criticism of anybody, but you know, when I was a head teacher, I used to smile when people used to talk about we've got an open door policy. Open doors can be terribly drafty. If I, as a parent, pushed the open door at the school you ran, Alison, what would I find behind that open door? What is the substance to your statement? What will engage me as a parent and know that we are co-educating this child? Because let no teacher fool themselves that they are the main educator of the child. It is the parent. It is the parent that educates in the early years. It's the parent that hands the child to us for however many years of education. And it's the parent that continues that journey once they leave. Because those of you to have adult children know that the parenting just never seems to stop. They never go away in one way or another.
In the nicest possible way.
The nicest possible way, of course.
Absolutely, absolutely. You can empathise with that. We've got some questions here about early years. So,
yes.
Are there any specific things that you would want to say to those teachers who are going to be maybe reception teachers in September?
Yes.
Welcoming children to the school for the first time.
Yes.
What would you say to them?
Yes. Actually, that's a gift of a question. Thank you, whoever's written those in. Can I go back to the New Zealand experience and to the earthquakes there? So if you think when those earthquakes happen, children in the 2 to 6 age group would not have had the cognitive skills or the linguistic abilities to articulate what was happening to them in those earthquakes. And what the New Zealand researchers found is that 2 years or so down the line, those children have suddenly started to manifest profiles of behavior that would not be common behavior issues experienced in primary education. And those children have taken very deep therapeutic interventions to resolve some of those issues. Now, I think, without getting all touchy-feely about it, you know, education can be used therapeutically. It can be healing. We can calm children's anxieties and concern just by the way that we work. I touched on imitation. Let me expand that, particularly those, therefore, for the early years educators, that the learning the child had before the day of lockdown, the neural pathways that were helping operate that learning in whatever curriculum area, in whatever early years foundation stage domain, that part of the brain will have experienced fear and anxiety. It will have been a frightened brain. That will have caused, I'm using teacher talk here to explain some quite complex neuroscientific processes, but that fear will have frozen parts of those neural pathways. They'll be sluggish in the learning that we need them to facilitate once the child comes back to school. So my recommendation is, and I've talked this through with some colleagues who are neuroscientists, is teach something that's about imitation. You could do this across the age range, actually. Teach something that's about imitation. So it could just be, you know, putting your hands in different configurations and getting the children to copy that, doing that mirror activity, partnering the children like the penguins in one of my pictures. So they're not touching, but Sally does this particular action and Johnny has to copy it. Then Johnny does an action. I saw a lovely clip on TV about children returning to school where there was actually a dance class of only 6 or 8 students. And one student did one activity, like spinning around. And then the next student did spinning around, plus perhaps some reaching up their right arm. The next child did spinning around, reaching up the right arm and lifting up their left arm. And so you kept adding an action. So they were then imitating and repeating. And that practice, rehearse is what we call consolidating learning. When you teach new imitation activities, you'll get new neural pathways learning. And the new neural pathways, which will be active and dynamic, will kickstart the sluggish existing neural pathways. You could do this with secondary students by teaching a new sort of sport or game as part of PE. And PE is a problem area for secondaries at the moment. How do they manage the changing routines when you can't possibly get a whole year group into the changing rooms? Are we going to live with smelly adolescents who've had games first thing in the morning, or what? And it may be just we need to go for milder forms. I even was talking to my son about using his PE specialist as doing intervention across classes rather than formal PE lessons. We may need to be very creative with the curriculum, but think imitation. Imitation is the foundation of all learning. We could go out this weekend and learn a new sport, and we would actually imitate our coach in the first instance. It never stops. We never stop imitating.
And of course, while you know you're watching somebody else and trying to follow their actions, you're also reconnecting.
Yes.
There's been so much, hasn't there, over the last number of weeks, where, you know, through isolation, all of us have had to find new ways of connecting. And you're quite right to think about this transition time.
Yeah.
So it's been true that some children have not been able to go back into school before the end of term. Terms finish either this week or next week for most schools. And the idea that you then suddenly, when you do go back in September, you're not with the teacher that you left behind.
Yeah.
There is a sort of a real transition kind of gap there.
Yes.
I'm interested, and again, we've had questions about the children that seem to be fine. So, you know, in fact, even on Twitter this morning, when I said that we were going to be having this conversation, there are some people that sort of come back and say, oh, well, we'll just need to just get on with everything. It'll all be all right. And I guess for some children who may have had a positive experience, they're quite resilient and so on. That may well be the case. But I'd be interested to hear from you about the children who are presenting as if they're okay, but actually there may well be signs that we could look for that might show that perhaps.
Yes. You broke up a little bit there, Alison, but I think I've got the gist of it.
Okay.
Remember that first level of the recovery curriculum was about being holistic. There are messages for all children. What do we know factually? We know that children have been 3 to 6 months in lockdown. We know that all children have heard talk of coronavirus. We know that children, because televisions and radios will have been on at home, will have heard the rising daily death toll. What do some of those numbers mean? So there are things that this is about integrating that experience into the child's lived experience. What does Dylan Williams say about curriculum? The curriculum, the real curriculum, should be based on the lived experience of the child. They have just lived through a traumatic time. And as you say, they may present as fine and dandy, but we wouldn't ignore, if a child had been 6 months hospitalized for a medical condition, we wouldn't ignore that. We would want that child to be able to talk about it, even if it was very factual. I think in therefore presenting some things factually, we will discover that some children are not as bold and brazen as they're presenting, that there are undercurrents, that they're very good at masking and camouflaging. And we need to just be able to check out that it's fine, that they truly are fine, that this experience has been integrated. So there are those recovery conversations to have with all children and young people. And from there, we can plan more specific interventions.
Teachers this year who had their training interrupted. And although they've been doing lots and lots of things like logging into this podcast this evening and all sorts, the thought of taking on their first class following on from what's your advice for newly qualified teachers?
Yes, my advice for new qualified teachers is go back to my final point, that teaching is a relationship-based profession. Walk in there with your humanity first and your teaching skills second. Just let it flow. Listen to the children and listen to how you can respond. There are loads of resources out there. Even today, I've just commissioned some wonderful work I've seen on pandemic booklets to help children explore and consolidate this experience that they've gone through. Use some of those resources. I think we talk a lot at the moment about creating bubbles, and hopefully any NQTs joining our schools will be in a bubble with a more experienced teacher. And I think opportunities for joint planning are going to be absolutely vital for those NQTs, because these will be complex times to be starting your career. So the wisdom of a more experienced teacher is going to be absolutely vital, but that needs to be carefully thought through and managed. But do have a look at the recovery curriculum. All the time resources are going on there. There are 7,000 people on the recovery curriculum Facebook group. There's a LinkedIn group. There's a Twitter feed around it. So, you know, do look at those things. And going back to your previous point, I have to say, frankly, Alison, anybody that thinks that Johnny left school on page 67 and is going to return to page 67 is naive.
Okay, thank you. Which is packed full of resources as you type. Can I go back to some more questions? We've got so many questions here. I'm just having a look through. One of the teachers here is saying that she's really concerned that the home learning that her students will have, and she's concerned about how is she going to face that class and enable them, be able to teach them, because it'll be at different starting points. What would your advice be there?
I think my advice, my gut reaction would tell me, start with a topic that none of the children will have had experience of. It's not been part of the home learning. Start with something fresh that is open-ended, and that informally and without drawing attention to a particular child, you can gauge what knowledge they have acquired, what skills they have acquired, and can they apply those. Because actually they could have completed some of your online tasks beautifully, but because of the hypervigilance, it may, as that quote said, not have imprinted on the memory or not have imprinted deeply. So whilst they could kind of recall it, not in a way that they can action that knowledge in a useful way. So I think keep things very open and dynamic, lots of time for talking, because it could be when the child is seemingly doing a piece of creative writing that suddenly everything falls apart. Or I was so taken yesterday, the number of children in the primary school I was in, Alison, that talked about their worries about maths because of their parents not being able to do the maths and talk them through. And that I think children have got a revised opinion of teachers as well, because they said they can't explain it as well as my teacher could. And I was really disappointed. Those are the actual words.
Yeah.
So I think we
Yeah.
need exploratory activities. Things like forest school may be a good medium for having those incidental conversations with children. We need to recalibrate the curriculum next term. I would say, and I'm giving it in a lecture tomorrow, that the curriculum should be the servant of the child, not its master. And more than ever, we need a curriculum that's truly responsive to the needs profile of our children.
So, of course, we also need schools to feel confident that they can be in that responsive mode, don't we? So you referred to a speech that Amanda Spielman had given this week. You heard her on the radio.
Yes.
They've announced that they're going to be coming back and doing visits next term, but they're not inspections and they're not judgments in the same way that we've been used to thinking about OFSTED. What can you say to reassure colleagues who are worried they may be stepping straight back onto the treadmill when they get back to school in September?
Well, there will be a treadmill, but it'll be a treadmill that's about children's needs, actually. We're going to find ourselves talking about things we never thought we'd talk about with children. Of course we will, because we've all just lived through something we've never lived through before. It's been nobody's experience before. Are we, as grown adults, not trying to make sense of what we've gone through? This bizarre world, Alison, where you and I are both in our homes at the moment doing this call to 3,000 teachers, it's very odd. And I think as time moves on, we will try and process that and embed it. I think when OFSTED come in, and particularly if it's HMI coming in, they'll be looking at what are the trends in our children. That's the role of HMI. We need a national trend picture of what has happened and how schools have responded and how it's affected children's learning. We, as a profession, need to learn from this, and the people to gather that evidence for us are our HMI. So I think OFSTED have a very creative and constructive function in the term that's ahead. And it's not judgmental. It's about learning from each other. It's you that are managing the children. It's you that will have the stories and insights to share, but it's for HMI to take those away from school X, school Y, school Z, and then look at the trends across those schools and corroborate them on another set of visits with another set of schools. That's the cycle of evidence gathering that HMI should go through.
And I think it's incumbent on the profession actually to try to avoid that fear factor that has been associated with OFSTED so often. Because when I was speaking with Amanda Spielman last week, that is not what they're intending to do at all. What they want to do is to learn from the profession and share stories of practice in a very positive way. I think it's really important that we think about that. One of the other strands that's coming through, we've had quite a few questions about colleagues. So if you're returning to school and you know that one of your colleagues has experienced maybe a close bereavement, or maybe things have been very difficult for them, how should one deal with that? How should we help our colleagues?
I think there needs to be time in the staff room, and maybe not informal staff meetings, but just times of gathering. Maybe we've probably all been overeating in this pandemic. Maybe it needs to carry on for a while longer, and there's cake in the staff room or whatever. There's one of the podcasts is made by Amanda Mordy, who's executive head of Forest Oak and Merstone schools in Solihull, where they developed a program called Smile based on the NHS 5 Ways to Wellbeing, which is an ethos-based approach. And these last 2 years, I've supported Amanda and one of her lead teachers in doing an evaluation across 10 primary and special schools of that approach. And they have a thing called Caught Being Kind, which is a card that is given to a child or a teacher caught being kind. And the child and teacher at the end of a week with the most cards gets, so the teacher gets, I think it's probably a bottle of wine and a box of chocolates, and the child actually gets a prize too. It's simple strategies like that that will rebuild our school community. Actually, we have got a lot in common with our children from this, and maybe it's about sharing that humanity. But going back to your point about those colleagues, we do need to give them time to talk. And you asked me earlier about compassionate leadership, and it's about that head, that deputy, just checking in with that member of staff. Is everything okay? Is there anything more we need to do? Thank you for being here today. We cannot thank each other enough.
No, I think that's so right, and I know that people have worked incredibly hard over the last few months, since the beginning of March, when it began to be evident that schools were going to need to close. And then suddenly, of course, they weren't closed because schools have been open for vulnerable children, for the children of key workers. And people have had to work through their holidays. They've been trying to problem solve in impossible seeming situations. I can honestly say, I know it's my job to run the Chartered College, and I'm very proud of teachers, but I'm so proud of the way that people have stepped forward.
Likewise.
And I just really, I'm so glad that they're going to get a summer break, because it's so important when we think about next term and everything that you've been talking about. It takes emotional energy to give out and to listen and to create space in the way that you've described. Can I just finish, Barry, with asking you what has given you the strength that you've needed to do so much for so many thousands of teachers and children over the last few months? Where does your strength come from?
My strength comes from the children. Whatever job I've held, I've always tried to keep that child in my mind. I still carry very vividly some of my early classes, as it were, in my head. And sometimes if I'm making a decision, I run it past that child and seek the answer there. And their needs give me the purpose to carry on. This was not meant to happen to me at this point in my career, but it has. And I've been happy to give some thinking space when valued colleagues, particularly head teachers, who we also need to applaud in all of this, cannot imagine the complexities of their job, of the minutiae of detail, the overwhelming responsibility of keeping our children safe. They've had all of those practical things to do, and I can pull on that experience of 3 headships and just try and do some of the thinking and share that and put myself in their shoes. But ultimately, it's always about, for me, the children. And if my final breaths could be about making things better for children, then that's constantly my motivation. I said at the beginning, Alison, the thing I'm proudest of is not all the titles. It is that I am a teacher.
Well, thank you so much, Barry. It's been a wonderful experience talking with you this evening and thinking about all of your provocations about what we can do when we return to school full-time from September. The resources that you've shown us, there are so many things there clearly on your recovery website that colleagues will want to see. And the books that you've written, so Lenny and Lucy, we need to find out more about them and what happens to them when they go back to school. Thank you so much indeed. We will link to, obviously, this presentation. We'll link to all the resources that you have mentioned. We've been providing through the Chartered College resources related to COVID, but we're now kind of rebranding that. We're moving on from COVID, and we're going to think now about the future of teaching. It's the next priority for us for the next year, is to really help to think and have a global conversation about how can we help teachers, not only through the pandemic, but through this period of time when we're trying to make sure that we are professional, responsive, that we offer expertise, that we listen, that we're kind, we're compassionate. There's so much that's involved in being a teacher, which is, like you, why I'm so proud to be part of the profession. But most of all, thank you so much indeed for your contribution this evening and for what you've been doing. If I could, I would open up to tumultuous applause from the thousands of people who are listening, but as it's just me, just saying thank you very much indeed. And it's amazing. I've lost a few minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Alison. Thank you.